On the outskirts of a small, picturesque town nestled amidst rolling hills and dense forests, the 4th of July celebrations were always a grand affair. Families and friends gathered in the historic town square, eagerly anticipating the fireworks that would light up the night sky. But this year was different. Amy had recently moved to the town, drawn by its quaint charm and the promise of a fresh start. She had purchased an old Victorian house at the edge of town, a beautiful yet eerie structure with its overgrown garden and creaky floorboards. Despite warnings from some locals about strange occurrences on Independence Day, Amy was undeterred. She was determined to embrace her new life and immerse herself in the community's traditions. As dusk settled on the 4th of July, Amy found herself caught up in the festive atmosphere. The town square was adorned with patriotic decorations, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of barbecues and the laughter of children playing with sparklers. She wandered through the crowd, exchanging smiles and small talk with her new neighbors, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. Near the fountain in the center of the square, Amy spotted an old man sitting alone on a weathered bench. He appeared lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to twinkle. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" Amy approached him, hoping to strike up a friendly conversation. The old man turned to her slowly, his weathered face creasing in a melancholic smile. "Aye, it is indeed," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "But beware, young lass. This night holds secrets darker than the night itself." Amy's smile faltered slightly at his cryptic words, but she quickly dismissed them as the ramblings of an old-timer who perhaps enjoyed spinning tales to scare newcomers. She thanked him politely and moved away, joining a group of locals who were debating the best vantage point to watch the fireworks. As the sky darkened further, anticipation mounted. The first explosion of fireworks erupted in a dazzling display of color and light, drawing exclamations of delight from the crowd. Amy watched in awe as bursts of red, white, and blue painted the heavens above, casting a magical glow over the town square. But then, as quickly as they had begun, the fireworks abruptly ceased. Confusion rippled through the crowd, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Amy exchanged puzzled glances with her neighbors, her heart beginning to race with a growing sense of unease. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the air, though not a cloud marred the clear summer sky. The atmosphere had shifted palpably, as if a veil of uncertainty had descended over the festivities. Then, from the outskirts of the square, a blood-curdling scream pierced the stillness. Panic erupted like wildfire as people turned in horror toward the source of the sound. Some fled in terror while others stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the sudden turn of events. Amy's instincts screamed at her to run, to escape whatever unseen terror had gripped the town. She pushed through the panicked crowd, her pulse pounding in her ears, until she found herself on the deserted streets at the edge of town. The eerie silence that followed the chaos only intensified her fear. Glancing back toward the town square, Amy's breath caught in her throat. Among the flickering shadows cast by the fading streetlights, she thought she saw movement. Dark, indistinct figures that seemed to materialize and dissipate like wisps of smoke. "Died on the 4th of July." A whispered voice seemed to echo in her mind, chilling her to the core. With a shudder, Amy tore her gaze away and fled toward the safety of her Victorian house. The path seemed longer than she remembered, the night enveloping her in a suffocating embrace. The once familiar surroundings now appeared distorted and unnerving, as if she had stumbled into a twisted version of reality. Finally reaching the wrought iron gates of her home, Amy fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She stumbled inside and slammed the heavy door shut behind her, leaning against it for support. Her heart raced as she listened intently for any sign of pursuit. But the only sound that filled the house was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Amy sank to the floor, her mind reeling with fear and confusion. What had she witnessed in the town square? Were those apparitions real, or had her imagination been warped by the eerie atmosphere of the night? The old man's warning echoed in her thoughts, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something inexplicable and terrifying. Hours passed in a haze of dread and uncertainty. Every creak of the old house sent chills down Amy's spine. She found herself constantly peering over her shoulder, half expecting to see ghostly figures lurking in the shadows. Sleep eluded her, and when dawn finally broke, she was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The following days passed in a blur of unease and whispered rumors among the townspeople. Amy ventured cautiously into town, where she encountered wary glances and hushed conversations that ceased abruptly whenever she approached. It became clear to her that the events of that fateful 4th of July had left a lingering mark on the town, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow at the center of it all. One evening, Amy received an unexpected visitor at her doorstep, Mrs. Hawthorne, an elderly woman who lived down the street. Her usually warm eyes were clouded with concern as she peered at Amy through wire-framed glasses. "Dear, I heard what happened on the 4th of July," Mrs. Hawthorne began softly, her voice filled with sympathy. "You must be terribly frightened." Amy nodded slowly, unable to find the words to express the turmoil that had consumed her since that night. Miss Hawthorne hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "You see, dear, this town has a history," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Long ago, during the Revolutionary War, there was a fierce battle fought on these grounds. Many lives were lost, and the echoes of that tragedy still linger." Amy listened intently as Mrs. Hawthorne recounted tales passed down through generations, stories of restless spirits condemned to wander the earth, seeking justice for their untimely deaths. She spoke of sightings on the 4th of July, when the veil between the living and the dead was said to grow thin, allowing the spirits to roam freely once more. "It is said," Mrs. Hawthorne continued solemnly, "that those who ignore the warnings of the past may find themselves entangled in its darkest secrets." Amy's mind raced as she processed Mrs. Hawthorne's words. Could it be possible that the figures she had seen in the town square were not mere apparitions, but the restless souls of long-departed soldiers seeking vengeance? The thought sent a chill down her spine, and yet a part of her couldn't dismiss it entirely. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that ominous night continued to haunt Amy's every waking moment. She found herself drawn to the town's library, scouring old archives and historical records in the search of answers. The more she delved into the town's past, the more she uncovered tales of tragedy and loss, stories that seemed to mirror the eerie events she had witnessed firsthand. One afternoon, while poring over yellowed manuscripts and faded photographs, Amy stumbled upon a name that sent a shiver down her spine. Captain Jonathan McGregor, a valiant soldier who had led his troops into battle during the Revolutionary War. According to the accounts she uncovered, McGregor's regiment had suffered heavy losses on the very grounds where the town now stood. Could Captain McGregor and his men be the restless spirits she had encountered on the 4th of July? It seemed plausible, and yet Amy knew she needed more than mere speculation to uncover the truth. Determined to unravel the mystery, Amy embarked on a quest to piece together the fragments of the past. She sought out elderly residents who still remembered the tales passed down through their families, piecing together a patchwork of folklore and whispered secrets. Each story added a layer to the town's enigmatic history, painting a picture of a community haunted by its past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, Amy found herself standing once more in the town square. The memories of that faithful 4th of July were etched into her mind, but this time she found a newfound sense of purpose burning within her. Gathering her courage, Amy closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer to whatever forces may be listening. She spoke words of reverence and respect for those who had perished in the tumult of war, offering her empathy and understanding to the spirits she believed still lingered in the shadows. As she opened her eyes, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of peace and acceptance. The town square seemed bathed in a soft ethereal light, and for a fleeting moment, Amy thought she glimpsed a faint outline of figures standing amidst the ancient oak trees, not menacing or vengeful, but solemn and serene. "Died on the 4th of July," a whispered voice echoed in her mind once more, but this time it carried a hint of gratitude rather than fear. With a heart full of newfound understanding, Amy turned and walked away from the town square. She knew that the events of that night would forever shape her perception of the world around her, and she also knew that she had found her place in the tapestry of the town's history, a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring bonds that connected past and present, life and death. In the days that followed her quiet vigil in the town square, Amy found herself drawn deeper into the fabric of the community. She volunteered at the local historical society, helping to preserve and digitize records that chronicled the town's rich history. She listened intently to the stories shared by elderly residents, each tale adding new layers to her understanding of the town's enduring spirit. As summer faded into autumn, Amy's Victorian house became a haven not just for herself, but for others seeking solace and connection. Neighbors stopped by for tea and conversation, sharing memories and forging friendships that transcended the boundaries of time and space. The old man who had warned her on that fateful 4th of July became a frequent visitor, his tales now told with a twinkle in his eye and a hint of mischief. Together they pieced together the puzzle of Captain Jonathan McGregor and his regiment, unraveling the threads of history that had been woven into the very fabric of the town. They discovered letters penned by McGregor himself, chronicling the hardships and heroism of the soldiers as they fought for independence. Amy pored over these artifacts with reverence, feeling a deep connection to the past and a profound respect for those who had sacrificed everything for the freedom she now enjoyed. One chilly evening, as the leaves began to turn golden and a crisp breeze swept through the town, Amy gathered with her newfound friends in the town square once more. This time there were no fireworks or festive celebrations, only a quiet reverence that hung in the air like the first frost of winter. Together they lit candles and placed them around the fountain, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the cobblestones. Amy stood before the gathering, her voice steady yet filled with emotion as she spoke of the souls who had died on the 4th of July. She spoke of their courage and their sacrifice, of the bonds that connected them across centuries to the present day. And as the final candle was lit, a sense of peace settled over the town square. The shadows that had once seemed menacing now felt like whispers of gratitude carried in the evening breeze. The spirits of Captain McGregor and his men seemed to linger in the gentle glow, their presence felt but unseen, their stories woven into the tapestry of the town's history. From that day forward, the 4th of July in the small, picturesque town took on new meaning. It became a day not just of celebration, but of remembrance and reflection. Each year, the townspeople gathered at the fountain to honor the fallen, their candles illuminating the darkness and reaffirming the bonds of community that had endured through time. Amy continued to live in her Victorian house, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the warmth of her neighbors' friendship. She knew that the events of the fateful 4th of July had forever changed her, guiding her toward a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of life and the enduring power of memory. And as she looked out over the town from her window, watching the sunset behind the hills, she felt a sense of peace knowing that she had found her place in the story of the town, a story of resilience, courage, and the enduring bonds that connected past and present, life and death. The town of Oak Ridge was like any other small American town, charming and serene, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests. Its streets were lined with quaint shops and cozy homes, and every year on the 4th of July, the town came alive with vibrant celebrations. Families gathered in the town square, children ran around with sparklers, and the air was filled with the scent of grilled meats in anticipation for the fireworks that would light up the night sky. But this year, something sinister lurked beneath the surface of the festivities. Eloise and her husband Mark had recently moved to Oak Ridge. They had fallen in love with the town's charm and the promise of a quieter life away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They had purchased a beautiful old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, a fixer-upper with a sprawling garden that Eloise was eager to restore to its former glory. As the 4th of July approached, excitement buzzed through Oak Ridge. Eloise and Mark eagerly joined in the preparations, helping to decorate the town square and planning a small gathering at their new home. They had been warmly welcomed by their neighbors, who were eager to introduce them to the town's traditions and history. On the morning of the 4th of July, the sun rose bright and cheerful over Oak Ridge. The town square bustled with activity as vendors set up stalls selling lemonade, hot dogs, and cotton candy. Children darted around in patriotic attire, waving miniature flags and eagerly anticipating the evening's fireworks display. Eloise and Mark spent the day mingling with their neighbors, soaking in the festive atmosphere. As dusk approached, they headed back to their Victorian house to prepare for their gathering. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden as they set up tables and chairs on the spacious front porch. As darkness descended over Oak Ridge, the town square filled with eager spectators awaiting the fireworks. Eloise and Mark's gathering was in full swing, laughter and music mingling with the distant strains of patriotic songs. But as the first fireworks exploded in a dazzling array of colors, a sense of unease settled over the town. At first it was subtle, a flicker of movement in the shadows, a whisper of wind that seemed to carry voices from a distant past. Eloise brushed off the sensation, attributing it to the excitement of the evening. But as the fireworks continued, the unease grew stronger, a knot tightening in the pit of her stomach. Then, in the midst of the grand finale, chaos erupted. A deafening explosion rocked the town square, sending sparks and debris flying through the air. Screams echoed through the night as people scattered in panic, searching for safety amidst smoke and confusion. Eloise's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively turned toward her home, fear gripping her like a vice. "Mark!" she screamed, pushing through the fleeing crowd. She stumbled over fallen chairs and abandoned picnic blankets, her mind racing with dread. Where was Mark? Had he been caught up in the blast? Amidst the chaos, she spotted her neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, frantically trying to gather her grandchildren. "Eloise, dear, are you all right?" Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice trembling with fear. Eloise nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of her husband. "Have you seen Mark?" she asked urgently, her voice hoarse with panic. Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her face pale. "I haven't seen him since the explosion. We need to get out of here, Eloise. Something terrible is happening." Eloise's heart sank as dread washed over her. She fought back tears, knowing she had to find Mark no matter the cost. With trembling hands, she dialed his number on her phone, praying for a response. To her relief, Mark answered on the third ring. "Eloise, thank God you're okay," he exclaimed, his voice strained with urgency. "I'm at the house. Get here quickly, something's not right." Relief flooded through Eloise as she hurried through the chaos, following Mrs. Thompson toward the edge of town where their Victorian house stood. The streets were eerily quiet now, the distant sounds of sirens echoing in the night as emergency responders rushed to the scene of the explosion. As they reached their street, Eloise's heart sank once more. Their house loomed in the darkness, its once inviting facade now shrouded in shadows. The front porch where they had gathered just hours before was now deserted, chairs overturned and decorations scattered by the wind. Mark stood on the porch, his expression grave as he scanned the street for any sign of danger. He rushed to meet Eloise as she approached, enveloping her in a tight embrace. "I'm so worried," he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion. Eloise clung to him, her relief mingled with lingering fear. "What happened, Mark? What's going on?" Mark hesitated, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know exactly," he admitted quietly, "but whatever caused that explosion in the town square, it wasn't normal. It felt sinister." Eloise shivered, chill running down her spine. "Sinister? What do you mean?" Mark glanced around nervously, as if searching for words to explain the inexplicable. "I saw something just before the explosion," he began hesitantly. "A figure in the shadows, watching the crowd. It didn't look human, Eloise. Its eyes, they were glowing." Eloise's blood ran cold as she processed Mark's words. "Glowing eyes? What are you talking about, Mark?" "I know it sounds crazy," Mark replied, his voice trembling slightly, "but I swear I saw it. And then the explosion happened. It was like, whatever it was, it triggered it." Eloise stared at him in disbelief, her mind reeling with fear and confusion. The town square had always been a place of joy and celebration, but now it felt like a nightmare unfolding before her eyes. "We need to get out of here," Mrs. Thompson's voice interrupted their conversation, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something in this town, something dangerous." Mark nodded grimly, his jaw set with determination. "We can't stay here. We need to find out what's happening and get help." With that, they hurried inside the house, locking the door behind them and gathering around the kitchen table. The night stretched on in tense silence, punctuated only by distant sirens and the occasional flicker of lights outside. As dawn broke over Oak Ridge, Eloise and Mark ventured cautiously outside, their eyes scanning the deserted streets for any sign of life. The town square lay in ruins, the aftermath of the explosion a stark reminder of the terror that had unfolded just hours before. Emergency crews were still on the scene, combing through debris and tending to the injured. The townspeople gathered in small groups, their faces pale with shock and confusion. Rumors swirled through the crowd, whispers of a mysterious figure seen before the explosion, of strange occurrences in the days leading up to the 4th of July. Eloise and Mark joined their neighbors, offering comfort and support as they tried to make sense of the senseless violence that had shattered their peaceful town. But amidst the chaos and confusion, one question remained unanswered. What had caused the explosion? And who, or what, was responsible? Days turned into weeks as Oak Ridge struggled to recover from the tragedy. The town square was cordoned off as Investigators searched for clues while the townspeople tried to piece together their shattered lives. Eloise and Mark stayed close to home, their once idyllic Victorian house now a refuge for the growing unease that gripped the town. The sense of dread never truly left them. Night after night, Eloise found herself haunted by nightmares of glowing eyes and shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. She woke in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to shake off the lingering fear. One evening, as she sat alone in the dimly lit living room, Eloise heard a faint scratching sound coming from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat as she listened intently, her senses on high alert. The scratching grew louder, accompanied now by a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo through the empty house. Heart pounding, Eloise grabbed a flashlight from the table. She cautiously approached the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sound echoing eerily into silence. As she rounded the corner, the scratching intensified, seeming to come from the closed door at the end of the hall, the door to the attic. She hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. With a deep breath, she turned it slowly and pushed the door open, shining the flashlight into the darkness beyond. The attic was shrouded in shadows, the beam of light revealing dust-covered boxes and forgotten relics of years past. But what caught Eloise's attention was a figure huddled in the far corner, its back turned to her. It was unmistakably human, yet its presence sent a chill down her spine. "Hello?" Eloise called out tentatively, her voice barely whisper. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. Its shoulders hunched as if in pain or despair. Eloise took a cautious step forward, her pulse racing with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice gaining strength. "What are you doing up here?" Slowly, the figure turned toward her, and Eloise gasped in horror at what she saw. Its face was contorted with agony, its eyes hollow and lifeless, and yet they glowed with an otherworldly light that sent a shiver down her spine. Before she could react, the figure lunged toward her with unearthly speed, its hands outstretched as if reaching for her throat. Instinct took over as adrenaline surged through Eloise's veins. She stumbled backward, fumbling for the attic door, her heart pounding in her ears. With a desperate shove, she slammed the door shut and bolted down the hallway, the sound of scratching and tapping echoing behind her. She raced down the stairs, her feet slipping on the polished wood as she fled toward the safety of the front door. Mark appeared in the doorway, his face pale with concern. "Eloise, what's wrong? What happened?" Eloise could barely speak, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There's something in the attic," she managed to choke out. I saw it. The glowing eyes." Mark's expression hardened with determination. "We need to get out of here now." Together they rushed outside and into the waiting car, leaving behind their once beloved Victorian house and the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. As they drove away from Oak Ridge, the sense of relief was palpable, yet the questions lingered. What had they encountered that night? And would they ever find answers? Months passed and Oak Ridge slowly began to heal from the tragedy that had rocked the town to its core. The town square was rebuilt, and life returned to some semblance of normalcy. But for Eloise and Mark, the memories of that faithful 4th of July would haunt them forever. They relocated to a new town, far from Oak Ridge and its lingering shadows. Yet, even in their new home, they couldn't escape the nightmares that plagued their sleep. The glowing eyes, the figure in the attic, and the inexplicable terror that had shattered their sense of security. They tried to move on, to rebuild their lives in the wake of the inexplicable horror they had witnessed, but deep down, they knew that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, and some nightmares were not meant to be forgotten. As another 4th of July approached, Eloise found herself standing alone on the porch of their new home, watching the distant fireworks light up the night sky. The echoes of the past lingered in her mind, a reminder of the darkness that had once threatened to consume them. And as she gazed at the stars above, she couldn't help but wonder, would the town of Oak Ridge ever truly be free from the sinister forces that had unleashed terror on that fateful night? The sun blazed overhead, casting a golden hue over the quaint seaside town of Harborview. It was the 4th of July, a day of celebration and fireworks, yet a palpable tension hung in the air as guests arrived at the grand mansion of Mr. Theodore Crane, a wealthy industrialist known for his lavish parties and secretive demeanor. Among the invitees were 8 individuals from various walks of life, each receiving an ornate invitation that promised an evening of festivities and intrigue. They gathered in the opulent foyer of Crane Manor, exchanging polite nods and cautious smiles as they awaited their host's arrival. There was Dr. Emily Hawthorne, a renowned psychiatrist with a keen eye for human behavior, Mr. Jameson Ford, a dashing young actor with a penchant for charm and mystery novels, Mrs. Evelyn Banks, a widowed socialite with a sharp wit and a collection of scandalous secrets, Professor Gregory Stone, an esteemed archaeologist with a passion for ancient artifacts and hidden truths, Miss Abigail Blight, a talented pianist with a haunting past and a quiet demeanor, Mr. Thomas Reed, a reclusive author known for his dark and brooding novels, Mrs. Maggie Dean, a philanthropist with a mysterious fortune and a calculating gaze, and Detective Samuel Beckett, a retired investigator with a reputation for solving the most perplexing cases. As the clock struck 6, the imposing figure of Mr. Crane descended the grand staircase, his presence commanding attention. With a warm smile, he greeted his guests and invited them to join him in the parlor for cocktails before dinner. "I trust you all received my invitation with the promise of a memorable evening," Crane began, his voice resonating through the room. "Tonight, we celebrate not only the birth of our nation, but also the bonds that unite us. Please enjoy the festivities and indulge in the pleasures of my home." With that, the guests mingled in the opulent parlor, sipping champagne and exchanging polite conversation, while the sounds of the pianist filled the air with soft melodies. But beneath the veneer of elegance and camaraderie, a shadow of suspicion lingered, a feeling that this evening held secrets waiting to be unraveled. As the evening progressed, tension simmered beneath the surface as the guests enjoyed a sumptuous dinner in the mansion's grand dining hall. The atmosphere was jovial, yet tinged with an undercurrent of unease, amplified by the distant rumble of thunder and flashes of lightning on the horizon. Detective Samuel Beckett observed the interactions with a keen eye, noting the subtle dynamics and hidden agendas among the eclectic group. Mrs. Evelyn Banks engaged in animated conversation with Professor Gregory Stone, their debate on ancient civilizations masking a deeper exchange of veiled insults. Meanwhile, Dr. Emily Hawthorne observed Mr. Thomas Reed with a thoughtful gaze, her curiosity piqued by the enigmatic author's quiet demeanor. As dessert was served, a decadent chocolate torch, the lights flickered momentarily before plunging the room into darkness. Murmurs of surprise filled the air, followed by nervous laughter as the storm outside intensified. Mr. Crane apologized for the inconvenience, assuring his guests that the power outage was merely a temporary setback. But when the lights flickered back on, a scream shattered the fragile peace. The guests rushed to the source of the scream, the conservatory, where Miss Abigail Blight stood frozen in shock, her eyes wide with horror. Lying amidst a bed of exotic flowers was Mr. Jameson Ford, his handsome face twisted in agony, a single red rose clenched in his lifeless hand. Detective Beckett knelt beside the body, his trained eyes scanning the scene for clues. The room was pristine, save for the overturned vase of lilies and the faint scent of bitter almonds that hung in the air, an ominous sign that sent a chill down his spine. "He's been poisoned," Dr. Hawthorne stated grimly, his professional demeanor masking a flicker of concern. "The scent? It's cyanide." Mrs. Maggie Dean gasped, clutching her pearls as she glanced around the room with wide eyes. But who would? Why would anyone?" Professor Stone stepped forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "It appears we have a murderer in our midst," he stated, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We must find out who among us had the means and motive to commit such a heinous act." Mr. Crane, visibly shaking, nodded in agreement. "Detective Beckett," he said, his voice betraying a hint of fear. "We must investigate this matter thoroughly. We cannot allow a killer to remain among us." With a solemn nod, Detective Beckett began his investigation, questioning each guest and searching for clues that might reveal the identity of Mr. Ford's killer. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tumultuous emotions within Crane Manor as suspicion cast a long shadow over the remaining guests. Hours passed as Detective Beckett meticulously pieced together the puzzle, uncovering hidden motives and buried secrets among the guests. Mrs. Evelyn Banks was revealed to have a bitter rivalry with Mr. Ford, stemming from a scandalous affair that threatened to ruin her reputation. Professor Gregory Stone's obsession with ancient poisons and artifacts hinted at a darker knowledge that raised unsettling questions. Dr. Emily Hawthorne's interest in human behavior led her to scrutinize the interactions among the group, searching for subtle clues that might expose the killer's motives. Meanwhile, Mr. Thomas Reed's reclusive nature and mysterious past cast a shadow of suspicion over his every move, while Mrs. Maggie Dean's vast fortune and philanthropic endeavors raised questions of greed and hidden agendas. Miss Abigail Blight's haunting melodies and fragile demeanor hinted at a tragic past that might hold the key to understanding the events unfolding around them. As the night wore on, tensions reached a boiling point, each accusation and revelation pushing the guests closer to the brink of paranoia. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, its fury echoing the turmoil within Crane Manor. In the early hours of the morning, as the storm finally began to subside, Detective Beck gathered the guests in the parlor once more. His gaze swept over each face, his expression unreadable as he prepared to reveal the identity of Mr. Ford's killer. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice commanding attention, "the time has come to unmask the truth. Through careful investigation and astute observation, I have uncovered the one among us who is responsible for the murder of Jameson Ford." The guests held their breaths, their eyes fixed on Detective Beckett as he paused for dramatic effect. "The killer," he continued, his voice steady and unwavering, "is none other than—" Suddenly the lights flickered once more, plunging the room into darkness. A moment of confusion and panic followed, voices raised in protest and fear as the guests groped in the darkness for answers. When the lights flickered back on, Detective Beckett lay sprawled on the floor, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. Shocked gasps filled the room as the guests recoiled in horror, their eyes wide with disbelief. "Detective Beckett!" Mrs. Maggie Dean cried, rushing to his side with trembling hands. "Who could have—" But before she could finish her sentence, a cold voice cut through the air, a voice filled with triumph and malice. "I couldn't allow him to expose me," Mr. Crane declared, stepping forward with a chilling smile. He was getting too close to the truth. It had to be done. The guests stared at Mr. Crane in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. He had invited them to this mansion under false pretenses, orchestrating a deadly game of deception and betrayal. "I killed Jameson Ford," Mr. Crane admitted, his gaze sweeping over the room with cold indifference. "And I killed Detective Beckett to ensure my secret remained buried. And now I'm going to kill all of you." With a roar of outrage, Professor Gregory Stone lunged at Mr. Crane, his fists raised in fury. The two men grappled in a desperate struggle, crashing into the furniture as chaos erupted around them. Dr. Emily Hawthorne seized the opportunity to call the local authorities on her cell phone, her voice urgent as she reported the murders and requested immediate assistance. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, Mr. Crane was subdued and restrained, his reign of terror brought to a dramatic end. The remaining guests huddled together in shock and relief, their hearts heavy with the weight of the night's horrors. In the days that followed, the residents of Harborview whispered about the events that had unfolded at Crane Manor, a tale of murder and betrayal that had shattered the illusion of civility and trust among the town's elite. Detective Beckett was mourned as a hero, his dedication to justice remembered by all who had witnessed his final act of bravery. Mr. Crane was swiftly brought to trial, his crimes exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. As for the guests who had survived that fateful night, they carried with them scars that would never fully heal. The bonds forged in fear and suspicion had forever altered their lives, a reminder that beneath the facade of wealth and privilege lay darkness waiting to be unleashed. And so, as the sun set over Harborview on the 4th of July, the echoes of that tragic night lingered in the air, a cautionary tale of how even the brightest celebrations could be marred by shadows of deceit and murder. The boat rocked gently as it approached Ash Island, a solitary mass of land, shrouded in mist and surrounded by the turbulent waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the 4th of July, and 5 friends, Jessica, Mark, Sophie, Tom, and Emily, had rented a secluded house on the island to celebrate the long weekend. The house, an old Victorian mansion, stood imposingly on a hill, its dark windows like empty eyes staring out over the island. As they disembarked and made their way up the winding path, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding that none of them could quite shake off. "This place is amazing," Mark exclaimed, trying to lighten the mood as they approached the house. "It's like something out of a movie." "A horror movie," Sophie muttered under her breath, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows between the trees. They entered the house, its heavy wooden door creaking ominously on its hinges. Inside, the air was stale, and a faint scent of decay lingered. The floorboards groaned under their feet as they explored the rooms, each one filled with antique furniture and dust-covered relics of the past. "Let's get unpacked and then head out to the beach," Jessica suggested, eager to dispel the eerie atmosphere with some sunshine and laughter. They settled into their rooms, each person choosing one on the second floor. As they unpacked, Emily noticed an old leather-bound journal on a dusty bookshelf in her room. Curious, she opened it and began to read. "June 17, 1892. The spirits grow restless. I fear the worst is yet to come," the first entry read. Emily shivered and closed the book, deciding it was best to leave the past alone. She rejoined her friends, and they spent the day swimming and sunbathing, the island's ominous presence forgotten in the warmth of the sun and the joy of their company. As the sun set, they returned to the house and started preparing for their 4th of July celebration. Fireworks, sparklers, and a barbecue were all set up in the backyard. Laughter and music filled the air as they toasted to friendship and the beginning of a memorable weekend. As darkness fell, the atmosphere began to change. The wind picked up, howling around the house, and the trees seemed to whisper secrets. The friends huddled closer around the fire, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Suddenly, the fire went out, plunging them into darkness. Mark cursed and fumbled for a flashlight, but before he could find it, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. They all turned towards the house, where the sound had come from. "Did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "It came from inside," Tom said, already moving toward the door. Reluctantly, the others followed him. Inside, the house was cold and dark, the only light coming from their flashlights. They followed the sound of the scream to the basement, where they found a trapdoor slightly ajar. "Do we really have to go down there?" Jessica asked, her voice shaking. "We need to see what's going on," Mark insisted, trying to sound braver than he felt. They descended the creaky wooden stairs, the air growing colder with each step. In the basement, they found a small room at the end of a narrow corridor. The door was half open, and inside, they saw an old rocking chair swaying back and forth, though no one was sitting in it. "Hello?" Emily called out, her voice echoing in the confined space. The chair stopped abruptly, and a chilling silence fell over the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and the lights flickered before going out completely. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. "What's happening?" Sophie cried, her voice filled with fear. Before anyone could answer, a deep guttural growl echoed through the basement. They turned their flashlights toward the sound and saw a figure standing in the corner, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. "It's not real," Tom whispered, more to himself than to the others. "It can't be real." The figure moved toward them, its form becoming clearer. It was a woman, or at least it had once been. Her face was twisted in a grotesque snarl, and her hands were covered in blood. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice reverberating through the basement. "This is my home." The friends scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The ghostly woman advanced, her eyes fixed on Emily. She reached out a skeletal hand and touched Emily's arm, and a searing pain shot through her body. "Emily!" Jessica screamed, trying to pull her friend away. But it was too late. The ghost dragged Emily into the darkness, her screams echoing in the confined space. Panic set in as the remaining friends fought to escape. Mark found a loose brick and used it to break a small window. One by one, they climbed through, cutting themselves on the shards of glass, but they didn't care. They had to get out. Once outside, they ran toward the boat, but it was gone, the dock empty. Desperation set in as they realized they were stranded. "We have to find another way off this island," Tom said. trying to keep his voice steady. Maybe there's another boat somewhere. They searched the island but found nothing. Exhausted and terrified, they decided to return to the house, hoping to find some clue about what was happening. Inside, they found the journal Emily had been reading earlier. Mark picked it up and began to read aloud. July 3rd, 1892. The ritual is complete. The spirits are bound to this house. They will protect it from intruders. Ritual? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. What kind of ritual? There's more, Mark said, his voice shaking. July 4th, 1892. The spirits have taken their first victim. They will not rest until all who enter this house are gone. We need to leave, Jessica said, her voice filled with terror. We need to get off this island now. But it was too late. The ghostly figure appeared again, her eyes burning with rage. One by one, the friends were picked off, their screams echoing through the house. In the end, only Mark survived. He managed to hide in a small closet, praying that the spirits wouldn't find him. He stayed there all night, listening to the sounds of his friends being murdered. When morning came, he emerged from his hiding place and made his way to the dock. To his relief, the boat was waiting. He climbed aboard and sailed away, never looking back. Years later, Mark would tell the story of the haunted house on Ash Island, but no one would believe him. They said it was just a tale to scare children, but Mark knew the truth. He knew that the spirits of Ash Island were real, and they would never rest. The house on Ash Island still stands, its dark windows staring out over the water, and on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the screams of the spirits who haunt it, forever trapped in their own personal hell.